Hello everyone, this is Lecture 6, Chapter 11 from our textbook, Race and Ethnicity. Learning objectives for this chapter include explaining the social construction of race and ethnicity, describing the extent and causes of prejudice, distinguishing discrimination from prejudice, identifying examples of pluralism, assimilation, segregation, and genocide, and assessing the social standing of racial and ethnic categories of U.S. society. Whatever people may think, race is not a black and white issue. It's very important to keep this in mind. There are plenty of people that we consider white in the United States that we didn't consider white when they began to enter the United States in large numbers through immigration. Jewish people, Italian people, Polish people, even German people at some point were not considered to be white when they first came to the United States in large numbers, as the existing white population feared these new numbers of people who would be making demands on the resources available. So Polish, Irish, Italian, Jewish, and even German folks were not considered white when they first came to the United States in large numbers. And then in terms of race, of course it's not a black and white issue, as we have people who are mixed races, we have Latinos who can be of any race. There are black Latinos, white Latinos, and even Asian Latinos. So the issue of race has never been simple in the United States, and probably won't be into the distant future. Race is a socially constructed category composed of people who share biologically transmitted traits, and race is considered important by members of society. Meanings of importance of race vary across time and place, as no society contains biologically pure people, and there's more genetic variation within each racial category than between categories. So that means there's more differences between me and another black person. For those of you who have not figured it out, I am African American or black. There's more difference between me and another black person than there is between black people in general when compared to white people in general. What is ethnicity versus race? Ethnicity is shared cultural heritage. Like race, ethnicity is socially constructed, and for most people, ethnicity is more complex than race, because ethnicity, since it's cultural heritage, is linked to where people are from, what religious beliefs that they adhere to, other cultural things in terms of values, philosophies, or even the foods that they consume. And while it's thought that there are only a few races within the United States, there are definitely more than a few ethnicities. Remember, race is constructed from biological traits, whereas ethnicity is constructed from cultural traits such as ancestry, language, or religion. Take a look at Table 11.1 in your books for more clarification on racial and ethnic categories in the U.S. What is a minority? A minority is any category of people distinguished by physical or cultural difference that a society sets apart and subordinates. Remember, when we usually think about minorities, we think about numbers of people. To belong to a minority means you belong to a group of people which has a lower number than whoever the majority is. Minority also, from a sociological perspective, once again, is any category of people distinguished by physical or cultural difference that a society sets apart and subordinates. So even though there are more women in the world, in just about every culture you can think of, women are considered minorities because they are subordinated to men. General characteristics include that make people a minority include race, sex, sexual orientation, and even being poor. And subordination means being saddled with lower status. So that means you have fewer opportunities just because of certain characteristics that you hold. A lot of immigrants in the U.S. do the jobs that no one else wants, and especially in agriculture and food service. About half of all housekeepers, household cooks, tailors, and restaurant waiters are men or women born abroad. Few immigrants make much more than the official minimum wage, and rarely do immigrant workers receive any health or pension benefits. Prejudice is a rigid and unfair generalization about an entire category of people, whereas a stereotype is an exaggerated description applied to every person in some category. So we're all prejudiced to a certain degree, but we don't necessarily believe in exaggerated descriptions or stereotypes. Stereotypes, stigma, and labeling are important. Stereotypes are important because we might have biases that can cause us to treat people in a negative way. Stigma is when we say those negative things to people and they begin to internalize them. And then labeling is important. If you treat a person as if you think that they're a criminal, they might start to believe that they themselves are criminals, even if they haven't done anything criminal at any point. In terms of minorities, let's remember that group size is not always a factor, as women in the United States outnumber men, but from a sociological standpoint, women are considered a minority. Blacks outnumber whites in South Africa drastically, but blacks are considered a minority in South Africa. In terms of measuring prejudice, some social scientists use a social distance scale, and student opinion shows a trend toward greater social acceptance. So younger folks tend to accept people who are different, people who are minorities, much more easily than, say, older folks. People see fewer differences among various minorities, more that we hang out with one another. The more we see that we're not all that different, we have some of the same difficulties, we cheer when we have the same successes. September 11, 2001 might have reduced some social acceptance of Arabs and Muslims. Remember, that was the terrorist attack where the World Trade Center and the Pentagon got some jets were taken over and used as bombs to attack the World Trade Center in New York City and to attack the Pentagon. Racism is a belief that one racial category is innately superior or inferior to another. Racism was widespread throughout the United States history, where ideas about racial inferiority supported slavery and Jim Crow, laws on intermarriage between whites and blacks. But there's been a decrease in overt racism in the U.S. because of changing beliefs as well as changes in laws. But racism can still be a serious social problem, and a lot of people believe that racism is what has led up to the Black Lives Matter movement and how individual police departments throughout the United States treat young men of color. There are various theories of prejudice. The one's the scapegoat theory. Disadvantaged people unfairly blame minorities for their own problems. And some people feel that this has had a role in the recent election of Donald Trump to the presidency. Working class whites in rural areas feel that their places in the localities that they live in the world have been left behind, and that resources from the federal government unfairly go to other people. Not to get into it too deeply here, but there are various theories to refute that. Another theory of prejudice, or of the authoritarian personality theory, as rigid moralists see things in black and white, and these authoritarian personalities believe that they themselves and people like themselves are always right, and anybody who is different is wrong. Culture theory argues that prejudice is embedded in culture, and some people are raised to be prejudiced toward others who are different. That kids actually learn prejudices from their parents or other elders. And then social conflict theory argues that prejudice serves as self-justification for the rich and powerful in the U.S. If you are of a race, not just in the U.S., if you are the majority race of wherever it is you live, and you have the powerful and you're rich, you argue that you are entitled to those riches and that power because your race is better than the subordinate races. Conflict theory also argues that there's a cultivation of climate of race consciousness for greater power and privileges by minorities. So conflict theorists argue that racial minorities are starting to push back against prejudice and stereotyping by the promotion of their own rights and their own contributions to society as members of subordinate races. There's institutional prejudice and discrimination, which are biases built into the operation of society's institutions. Historically, there are a number of opportunities that African Americans, Latinos, and Asians take for granted today that they didn't have access to in America's past, such as higher education or management positions in certain businesses and industries. The theorists Carmichael and Hampton argue that people are slow to condemn or recognize institutional prejudice and discrimination, as these often involve respected public officials and long-established practices. Nobody who is on top wants to say that they are on top because the people that they lead have been discriminated against. Everybody who on top wants to be able to say, well, I got to be on top because of my own talents and my own hard work, as opposed to being able to say, yeah, I'm on top because there are people of color who are better than me, but those people got held back because of discrimination within our workplace or whatever the institution is. Prejudice and discrimination began as ethnocentric attitudes, and this can lead to groups being placed in a situation where they are socially disadvantaged and labeled. A group's situation is explained as a result of innate inferiority rather than looking at the social structure, and this cycle tends to repeat itself. People who are born into a particular ethnicity or race that is considered subordinate, future generations of that ethnicity or race will also be considered subordinate unless there's wide-scale social change. In terms of interactions between the various races and ethnicities, we have different examples: pluralism, assimilation, segregation, and even genocide. Pluralism is when people of all races and ethnicities are distinct but have equal social standing. We refer to this as a salad bowl. If you think about a salad, each and every element that goes into a salad remains that element, but remains its own element, but they exist harmoniously to create a salad, like your lettuce, your tomato, your onion, your various dressings, croutons, what have you. They remain their own separate elements, but they all work together for that one salad. In assimilation, this is when minorities gradually adopt patterns of the dominant culture. We call this, instead of the salad bowl, we call this the melting pot. When people from various backgrounds all come together and eventually start to share the same traits. An example of an assimilation might be when ethnic minorities come to the United States and they come from cultures where they have lots of children. After a generation or two, that ethnic minority will start to have the same number of children of the general United States. The 2 point whatever kids that the United States has on average, households in the United States have on average now. Whereas people from Sub-Saharan Africa, people from Latin America, they come from cultures where they have more than 2 point whatever kids. But they come to the United States, after a couple of generations, they have no more than 2 kids. Miscegenization good Lord, miscegenation, that's it. Miscegenation is the biological reproduction by partners of different racial categories, and it used to be illegal in the United States because of the desire by whites to keep the white race pure, even though there's no such thing as a pure race. And if you look at white history, as whites from Western Europe engaged in imperialism throughout the world, white men who were explorers always had sex with the people that that they ran into in the various places outside of Europe that they were quote unquote exploring. So technically speaking, you might have had laws that fought against miscegenation, but historically whites have always been mixing with the other races. Segregation is both the physical and social separation of categories of people. Usually when we talk about segregation in the United States, we talk about how it affects housing patterns. I'm a former housing expert, and I still think about housing in terms of home ownership. There's a big discrepancy between the average wealth of black households and white households, and historically we've argued in the United States a way to close that gap is to promote home ownership for blacks. But if you think about it, because of the way that residential segregation works, that's not necessarily the only policy we should be pursuing if we're concerned about closing the wealth gap between black and white households. So think about it this way. There's more whites than blacks, so there's always going to be more demand by whites to live in white neighborhoods in general. And then to think about it another way, there's always going to be more people of color who want to live in white neighborhoods, whereas for the most part, only blacks or only predominantly black households are going to want to live in predominantly black or all black neighborhoods. So there's just more demand for white houses in white neighborhoods. Since there's more demand for something, when that something goes to be sold, it could command a higher price. Genocide is another another form of interaction between races and ethnicities, and it's the unfortunate systematic killing of one category of people by another. The big nasty ones in history include the Holocaust in the 20th century, but throughout history, Jewish people have been subject to a number of pogroms where literally hundreds of thousands of Jewish people have been killed. The Hutus and Tutsi conflict in Rwanda is a recent one. Ethnic cleansing in the former Yugoslavia was another. Lots of unfortunate, ugly examples of genocide that still happen even in a world in which we're supposed to be on the long arc towards justice and peace. Native Americans in the United States have experienced forced assimilation. We used to take Native American kids away from their parents and have them adopted by whites. We took them away from their parents and sent them to Bureau of Indian Affairs or BIA schools so they could learn how to be American and leave behind their old cultures. Native Americans have experienced relocation forced from various places in the American Southeast to the American Midwest. And Native Americans have experienced low social standing. There are currently 41 American Indian nations recognized in the lower 48 states, and then 6 Alaska Native nations, which are made up of more than 600 smaller tribal groups. Officially recognized tribal groups have to demonstrate that they have a certain number of people that belong to them, a certain, their own language, as well as claims to a particular place that they mostly lived in throughout their old tribal history. Some tribes prosper, but most Native Americans remain severely disadvantaged and share a profound sense of injustice. Some tribes that have prospered include the Picos of New England, who were one of the first Native American tribes to take advantage of casino development. And the Picos now use monies made in their casinos to send all of their children who want to go they enable them to go to college. And you start in a lot of Native American casinos, you start to see a little bit of economic development. Native Americans using the monies from casinos that are generated within their communities to start other kinds of businesses. When we talk about white Anglo-Saxon Protestants or WASPs in the United States, we really don't consider them to be an ethnicity, but that is exactly what WASPs are. Irish, Italians, Polish, African Americans, Germans, those are all ethnicities and or races, but white Anglo-Saxon Protestants are race. White is a race, and Anglo-Saxon Protestant is an ethnicity, just like all the others. 33 million people in the United States claim this background, and historically it's been made up of highly skilled and motivated immigrants who have done well economically. White Anglo-Saxon Protestants have higher social standing than other immigrants, but as a group their wealth and power peaked in the 1950s. And they assume that terms race and ethnicity do not personally apply. When white Anglo-Saxon Protestants talk about Americans and talk about themselves, they never talk about themselves until very recently as white and Anglo-Saxon Protestants. They just refer to themselves as Americans, whereas the rest of us have the conditional, like I'm African American or Black American. African Americans, folks of African descent that soon became synonymous with being a slave when they came to the United States. Slavery became the foundation of Southern colonial plantation system, as well as infrastructure development in terms of the buildings of roads and some canals in the United States. The 13th Amendment outlawed slavery in the United States, and that's probably the earliest successful result of the civil rights of the long civil rights movement. And then in the 1950s and 60s we had more action under the national civil rights movement, especially here in Alabama and here in Montgomery. Martin Luther King led a movement from here, Rosa Parks and others, Lillian White, who recently participated in a presentation at the Rosa Parks Museum. Ms. White, who's still with us, was one of the people who led the bus boycotts here in Montgomery. And then racial caste remain strong in the U.S. If you're born poor and black in the United States, there's a high probability that you'll be poor when you die. Asian Americans, that's probably it's a category with enormous diversity. Asian Americans, on the whole, earn more than even white people, and are subject to the model minority stereotype. I did my MBA at Rice University in Houston, Texas, and one of my best friends from there is Chinese American. And when I got my first job out of business school in Los Angeles, he came to visit. And I was joking with him. Here in Los Angeles, Asians can be as crazy as anybody else. You don't have to be the model minority. And I took him to Venice Beach to show him like Asian cats from Los Angeles who actually had dreadlocks, and he thought that was hilarious because he thinks of Chinese Americans as being traditional and trying to conform and show the world that they could be as hardworking as any white people. And I said to him, "Oh no. There's some crazy Chinese folks in America too. Just as crazy as black folks." Took him to Venice Beach and showed him all these artists and visual artists, people, Chinese Americans who do paintings, Chinese Americans engaging in performing arts, juggling and somersaults and whatnot on Venice Beach. We had a good time checking them out. Hispanic and Latino Americans, also difficult to cram all those folks into this category because there are a number of countries that a person can be from and be considered Hispanic or Latino. The big difference is those folks who consider themselves to be primarily descended from Spain would be called Hispanic, whereas Latinos are those folks who consider themselves to be descendants of Latin America. So there's some cultural sharing, but there's some ethnic differences in that they might consider themselves either Hispanic or Latino depending upon where their ancestors are from. So over 52 million people are of Hispanic descent in the U.S. 16-17% of the U.S. is now Hispanic or Latino. There are clusters of distinct populations, each of which identifies with a particular ancestral nation. The median family income is below the national average, but above African Americans. And some examples include Mexican Americans, Puerto Ricans, and Cuban Americans. What else can I say about Latinos? Oh, there are white Latinos, brown Latinos, black Latinos, and Asian Latinos. There's a big Japanese population of a number of South American countries. Anyway, Arab Americans are increasing in size because of the turmoil in the Middle East and because of the religious freedoms that we have here. So a lot of people will move to the United States to pursue education and business opportunities to provide safety for their families. Their ancestors lived in a variety of countries and cultures, and Arab Americans, that's another umbrella term that can be pretty non-specific, as Arabs differ from society to society. All social classes are represented. There are poor people, poor Arabs, middle class Arabs, and very rich Arab Americans. These folks are often stereotyped as terrorists and a target of hate crimes because of 9/11 and terrorist acts done in the name of Islam throughout the world. In your book, there's a picture of a mosque that stands above the cornfields in a rural area near Toledo, Ohio, which is pretty close to where I grew up. If I had an hour south on US 23 from Ann Arbor, Ypsilanti, Michigan into Ohio, I actually can see that mosque from the highway. White ethnic Americans persist in many U.S. cities, especially in the northeast region of the country. These are primarily working class men and women whose ancestors came to the U.S. as immigrants. And some of them, when they first came to the U.S., such as the Irish and the Italians, endured prejudice and discrimination. Not as bad as slavery, but in other ways as bad as prejudice and discrimination experienced by African Americans after the ending of slavery. To many more people, areas such as Philadelphia's Italian market are a source of attractive cultural diversity. If you've never been to Philadelphia, you should definitely check out the Italian market. It is a lot of fun, lots of delicious places to have something to eat. Looking ahead, the U.S. will remain a land of immigrants. We talk a lot about illegal immigration in the United States and the cost of having to deal with it. It makes you think that the United States is relatively unwelcome to immigrants. But in actuality, the United States lets in more immigrants than any other country. The United States is what is considered a settler society. The United States, Australia, and Canada are all settler societies where white Europeans went into other places in the world and established new countries and are relatively welcoming to immigrants. Our developed world peers in Western Europe and in Japan and South Korea, they do not like immigrants as much as we do. Here in the United States, if you go through the process of immigrating legally, you will be accepted to the most part, unless you end up living in a place where a lot of prejudiced people who are afraid of terrorists. Immigration occurred in a big way after World War II and swelled as government relaxed immigration laws in the 1960s. Today's immigrants are Latin American, Asian, Mexican, Asian Indians, and Filipinos, and a lot of Africans are immigrating to the United States to take advantage of our economy and start businesses, to pursue home ownership opportunities and They've just figured that the opportunities that they would have in the United States would be better than what they'd have back in their home countries. I think that's it. Thank you.